Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time you're tuning in the program called What's Going On FlintTalkRadio.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program, and as of this Monday, the third Monday of the month, I'm here by myself. But as you know, those who tune in the program on a regular basis, you know that Catherine Hunter Williams is here with us on the second and fourth Mondays, which means she'll be here next week. Want to thank you for tuning in on the number one podcast studio in Genesee County. And we're working very hard, of course, to continue to win your trust and hope to build our numbers so that we can begin to challenge the alphabet soup out there. You know, all of the networks that are trying to compete with us now. That's our goal, at least. I want you to stay tuned for the next hour. We're here from 2 o'clock to 3, and we will be talking about a couple of topics that are of some concern, hopefully, to you. And we'll see how that goes. I did want to say a couple of things about one of my favorite magazines? Time magazine. You know, John, they gave me an offer I couldn't refuse. And, you know, you can get these magazines right now for almost peanuts. And what they're doing, of course, is trying to just build a membership base because they actually run off the advertising. So I have the pleasure of getting a number of magazines for $2, and then they wanted me to add to my collection. I got two more magazines that came in, and one of them, I won't mention that one because I want to give those two back. Those last two that I got, mostly pictures. And I'm a reader, so when I buy a magazine, I'm trying to get some information. At least with Time magazine, I mean, there's one magazine that I got in that collection that I thought about taking some crayons out. I said, this got to be a coloring book, just nothing but pictures in there. I thought I was back in first grade. But at least with Time magazine, they give you a lot of information. And I wanted to bring your attention some of the articles they have in the one that's dated January 22nd of this year. And if I sound like I have a cold, you have picked up exactly where I am today. I'm kind of down with the weather, but the show goes on. We never cancel a program here at FlintTalkRadio.com unless we are snowed in or we have or I'm out of the country. Otherwise, we will be here. In the magazine, I thought this was quite interesting. In the magazine, Time magazine is apparently getting ready to do a 50th anniversary on the March on Washington. What they're asking for are a number of people to write in their memories of the March on Washington. And I'm really thinking about writing about that because I was at the March on Washington. I was a sophomore in college at the time, so that kind of dates me. And I was also at the Glenn Beck rally that was held on 8/28/2010 when they had, I can compare the numbers because I was there to see the numbers that were there in 1963, August the 28th, 1963. And I can tell you that those numbers that I saw in the Glenn Beck rally double the numbers that I saw at the original March on Washington that was called into existence by a continuation of an idea that had been born back in the 1940s under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Not too many people are aware maybe the history of this budgeting idea of having a March on Washington, but it goes back to the 1940s, around 1941 under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And it had been reverberating around in the community for 22 years, and finally was pulled off when a number of the so-called Big Six pulled the ends together and began to put this in the hands of a person that could organize it, a person by the name of Bayard Rustin, who was known for his organizational skills, and he was the one that put this march together. But it really had been reverberating around in the community for the last 22 years, from 41 to 63, and it was finally pulled off when the so-called Big Six got together and decided to go forward with it with a guy named, and somebody that's gotten out of the history books being left out of it, out of the history books because we built it around King. But there's a person that really, if I don't think if he had not been in the mix of that this could have been pulled off, and that was a person by the name of Asa Philip Randolph, who was the head of a black union called the Union of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids that was founded in 1925. And Asa Philip Randolph's name has gotten lost, but I think without him, I don't know if that march is really is pulled off. Anyway, in 1963, the march came about, and what Time Magazine is doing, and they're very good about this. I'm looking forward to the issue coming out in August, but they're asking for those that can reminisce about it back in that time period 50 years ago, and I think I'll probably write a couple of things about what I saw. I don't know if it'll be printed, but I think I'll write about a few things. But I really would like to, I would like to really write about contrasting the March on Washington in 1963 with one that I think served it very well on the 47th. I think that would have been the 47th anniversary of the March on Washington, when Glenn Beck pulled twice the numbers that were in the march when King was there, giving his "I Have a Dream" speech. Giving his "I Have a Dream" speech again, by the way, because it had been given on two other occasions before he arrived in Washington. He given it once in Birmingham, and he gave it really right down from where we are in Flint. Gave it down in Detroit in the Cobo Hall. And I've heard that speech, by the way, down there in Cobo Hall on tape. And it is very rough, by the way, in terms of the speech they gave. You could actually hear the lack of comfort in that speech. It was prepared text. I think that may have been what confined King when he gave it down there at the Cobo Hall, because what had happened there was that they had led a march down Woodward Avenue. And I think that numbers were, at that point, there's some that are saying 125,000 were marching down Woodward Avenue. The numbers get lost. You know, people will claim other numbers over time, and some are claiming it was even bigger than the March on Washington. So it's like the fish you caught and nobody saw it, so the fish was a whale. So the numbers get mixed up. But I think that the "I Have a Dream" speech needs to be understood, and the March on Washington needs to be understood and put into a context that fits into the narrative of 2013. Because, John, I'm going to need some tissue. This narrative we talk about in terms of civil rights, I think we have to tie it in with not only what happened back in 1963, but what has happened to update it in terms of what occurred when Glenn Beck had the foresight to call a demonstration in Washington. I don't know if you would call it a demonstration. It's really just a meeting in the park. I don't think they were actually protesting anything. I didn't get the impression they were out there protesting any particular thing, just having a rally to call the troops together to say that we're concerned about the direction the country is taking. And in that mall, I can tell you this, and I kind of saw the numbers in 1963. But when I looked at numbers back in that time period, now going on 50 years ago, and looked at numbers that occurred on 8/28/2010, I can tell you that those numbers that the number of people in that park, in that mall, double the numbers that I saw in the original March on Washington. That's just my observation, and of course I don't have any numbers to go by what really would be the official count of the numbers, because they've stopped giving the numbers out, given the controversies that have happened in the past in terms of how many people showed up and so on. So they don't do the estimates anymore, but I do an estimate on my own. And I can tell you that I looked at what I had in my memory of what I saw in that mall with people going on both sides of the Lincoln Memorial, and they have a long pool in that mall, and I saw people on both sides of it and going blocks down the way there. And it just really, the numbers that I saw in '63 and numbers I saw in 2010, I just don't think there's any comparison. And why would that be important? Because when King gave his I Have a Dream speech in 1963, there were an estimated 250,000 people in that mall that day. And the reports are of that 250,000 persons, 25,000 of them were in fact white. So it wasn't just black folks out there. But in 8/28/2010, that mall that was there to commemorate 47 years later, on that date, meeting to revive the dream. In that mall, there were not 250,000 of whom all but 25,000 were black. That mall was filled with white Americans. And the black Americans that were there were very small in number. We were the group that I went with, really, when I say group, there's only a couple of us that flew in and then rented a car once we got there. And of course, stayed overnight in a hotel. I think we were in Virginia, if I'm not mistaken. But in that mall, unlike in 1963, who had come to hear Dr. King's speech, didn't know it was going to be out there, I Have a Dream speech. But that's what it turned into for a lot of reasons. King had another text he prepared, and they're not prepared to give the I Have a Dream speech, which I said earlier he had given on 2 different occasions. But given the fact that his prepared text was really hampering King, and you can actually see that in terms of King trying to come off a text. You know, King was a Baptist preacher, and if you notice how, I was raised in a Baptist church, if you notice how the Baptist ministers start out, they start out on a text. And when they start out on a text, they're not really what you call, they're not hooting, as they say. And they start out on the text and they get the energy level up and they start feeling the words that they are speaking. And then they start to go into that which is not textualized to the point where they can kind of speak extemporaneous. And that's when they're at their best. And I think that's why there's such a difference in the speech he gave, that Dr. King gave in Detroit, and what he did in Washington, where you see that there were constraints. King gave the I Have a Dream speech, and it's very rough, not ironed out, a lot of kinks in it in Detroit. But in Detroit, I'm talking about. But which is, I think that was in June. In August, 2 months later, when King gives that I Have a Dream speech, which he had not intended to give, he was on another prepared text that he had prepared another speech, and that speech was not working. And if you read some of the books out about it, there's a person on the stage with Dr. King. He's over the group called the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and that's John Lewis. And Lewis hears Mahalia Jackson, and that may be another name that's gotten lost in terms of the contributions made in the civil rights movement as we centered around King's personage. But it wasn't just King, a lot of other persons that were playing vital roles in it as well. And one of the persons playing a key role was this person that was singing so that they could build up the confidence, because they had to go out there and face those dogs and cattle prods and those officers on horseback, and maybe in some instances, maybe people that are in the Klan organization. And they got to go out there with some vigor, and that could be very intimidating. So we had Mahalia Jackson was pretty much the singing voice of the civil rights movement. And on that stage, as King was reading his prepared text, according to John Lewis's book, John Lewis, who's now a representative from Atlanta that's in the Congress, but at that time was the head of the group called SNCC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And according to John Lewis in his book called Walking with the Wind, and I got to believe there was a person behind it that was writing that book. I just can't believe John Lewis wrote that book, not the way that he sounds when he's talking. It sounds like I just don't get the impression we're talking about a person that write on that level. I'm sure there's a ghostwriter in the back of it, but it's a well-written book, and it's a very good book with some very good insights in it. And according to John Lewis, Mahalia Jackson, the songstress of the civil rights movement, leaned into Dr. King as Dr. King was giving his prepared speech, and she said to Dr. King, tell him about the dream. And you can actually, if you go listen to the entire speech, because a lot of people think that Dr. King's speech starts with I have a dream. But if you go and listen to the entire speech, it's about 18 minutes long. About 5 minutes of that is Dr. King giving his prepared text. But then, if you listen to the speech, you'll see where Dr. King said, and despite the difficulties of the moment, I still have a dream. And that's when Dr. King makes the transition from his prepared text to the text that he had worked on in other occasions. And by this time, Dr. King, being the extemporaneous speaker that he was able to get into something that wasn't prepared, where you're going down, every sentence got to be mentioned, and you got to talk about this part, and that leads into this sentence here, and here's this paragraph after that is over. I mean, he's not as good at reading a teleprompter as the president is. And when he got away from his prepared text and he was switched over, because Mahalia Jackson said Dr. King told him about the dream, when he did that, then Dr. King took those 250,000 people on a journey. And that speech was riveting, and it reverberates all the way down 50 years later into our time. And that was one of the great moments in American history. There's no question about that. But I think that if you're going to talk about, if we really were honest about race relations in America, and we're going to talk about that in terms of a film just came out in a minute to tie it in with this film. I think you know what film I'm talking about, but I'm going to mention it anyway, whether you know it or not. That you really should talk about the March on Washington and the people that were there and the makeup of the crowd, and then talk about it 47 years later in 2010, where there is twice the number out there in the mall, and they have embraced the ideas that Dr. King talked about. And that was that in that park that day, and I was all over the park because I was just trying to find some room to sit down. I have these little folding chairs that I carry with me, and I was trying to find a place in that mall with all those persons packed in there to be able to spread out my little chair. A lot of people were sitting on the ground, and a lot of people standing around. You had to find some place you could kind of get in there where you could actually see, people not standing in front of you could see where they were on the stage. And that was very hard doing that in that mall. There were so many people. But I found, in laying out and looking over, first of all, putting the chair down and then looking over the vast crowd that was there and seeing the makeup of it, there could not have been more than 4%, and that may be a high number, of blacks that were in that mall that day. So if there were 500,000 persons there, and I think that may be even a conservative number, that mall was packed. I mean, it was going all the way down where King's group stopped, and then further back than that and going down, you couldn't even see the end of the group. It was that vast. And I think we have to put that into context, that this is 47 years later, and what that announced to me was those were those days, and these days are very different in terms of where America was then and where America is now. And I think we've got to talk about that in terms of what that means, in terms of the discourse that we need to be having in this country, because we have come a long way, baby.
You know, I was just wondering, as you're talking, I was wondering if the civil rights era could actually occur now. People have no sense of, everything's relative, morality is relative. The appeal that Dr. King was making was to a universal idea of a right and wrong, morality. a transcendent one. Right now, with this move afoot to be questioning, to actually be like hostile to moral absolutes, I don't think the civil rights movement would have gained a foothold. I really don't in the current era.
They had a Boondocks cartoon made of what it was raised the question: what if King had come back in this time period, from the time period in which he actually lived, and what would be the response he would have to the things that are now going on? And Aaron Magruder, who is the person that put out a number of episodes on Dr. King, had one episode where he has Dr. King in a coma, and Dr. King comes back and wakes up in this time period. And everybody was out there, as you were saying, with a certain amount of relativity as far as their morality is concerned. Everything is relevant. There are no specific rules in place. And at the end of that particular film depicting how King is shocked at what he sees, he has King saying that he's going to Canada. In other words, King would just throw his hands up in the air because he took all of these, I don't say beat downs. There was some of that. There wasn't a whole lot of that. It was just the fact that they were turning him around, putting him in jail and things of that sort. And Dr. King paid a price for standing up and trying to get some things changed in the country. And when you have an ultimate sacrifice, obviously you were committed to what you were doing, because King was under death threats for 13 years, ever since he led the bus boycott in Montgomery. But he never did stand down from his mission. He carried his mission through to completion. But if he came back to see what was happening right now, I don't know if he could. In fact, that question came up in one of my conversations with one of my friends. We were talking about it a couple of weeks ago, that if King could see the end result of where we are right now in this country, and where the black community is, by the way, in this country, what would King do if he knew the ultimate outcome would be what we're witnessing now in 2013? And the question was, would he engage the process the way he did, with absolute commitment as he did, knowing that this would be the outcome 50 years later from the I Have a Dream speech, and 45 years later from the time in which he was assassinated. And I had a very controversial position in that discussion. I know that because that's what they told me. But my position was that if you are, in fact, fighting for something, and you know the ultimate outcome of it a half century later, and you see that what you are sacrificing your life for has ended up with this bad result, if you knew that ahead of time, I said that if King could have seen into the future and saw where this was leading, they would be absolutely insane to engage with that level of commitment if he knew the outcome. You know, you never can know the outcome. But if you knew the outcome of your sacrifice is what we are looking at right now, and you can fortuitously, predict that, then why would you be out there doing those things? You do it out of the hope that what you're doing will make a difference. That's what all people who are trying to change society do. You do because you think it's going to actually make a difference in the lives of those who are coming after you. Otherwise, there's no hope. And so nobody struggles with the idea that the end result is going to be something worse than what it was when they first got out the blocks. I'm sure King, who I admired, I didn't agree with everything he said, but a lot of what he talked about I thought was really great. And I love the fact that he was very clear about having a dream, which he said was deeply rooted in the American dream. That's a very important pivotal point we need to understand right now. The King's dream was embraced in what the country said about itself.
So now, yeah, you bring an interesting point. Just as you said that, okay, about he was rooted in the American dream. Well, the American dream has a component which would be considered materialistic in a lot of people's observers, critics' minds. I don't see Dr. King being on the side of redistribution of wealth forcible and all that. I think he tried to wake the conscience of people. He would have tried to wanted people to do stuff voluntarily, but I don't see like what Obama's doing and this whole mindset now, like redistributing wealth basically by a gunpoint, using the tax laws and stuff like that. I don't think he'd been on board for that.
No.
I don't think he would have.
No, because his Christian teachings would have been prohibited for him joining that parade. He would not have been involved in that line. But this thing that they're doing right now, that's almost unconscionable. In fact, in some ways, it's a betrayal of the civil rights movement. When King was talking about he wanted his children to live in a country where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, King not talking about affirmative action. King is talking about an even level playing field. He's not talking about advantaging blacks over whites or whites over. He's talking about ending advantage, and calling for a level of colorblindness. It does not mean that you, when you say colorblindness, it doesn't mean you're saying you don't see color. You're saying that you don't see it as an impediment, or you don't see it as an advantage. It's just the reality. There are some people black in this country, some that are white in this country, some are Hispanic, and others. And that is not anything to use against someone or anything to make someone have an advantage. And what King was trying to do was end debilitating disadvantage based upon the group that persons belong to. But what we're saying right now, I think a lot of what we're looking at is a betrayal of the I Have a Dream speech that King gave and his vision that he had for this country. A lot of it is betrayal. I see it even in terms of the discussion going on right now with Ben Carson, who will be in town, by the way, in the state on the 22nd. I couldn't buy a ticket because it was sold out down here, and I think Romeo, the Tea Party down there, is bringing them in, and they've sold out. I couldn't get a ticket, but that does not mean I'm announcing this ahead of time. That does not mean I'm not going down there, and I'm not going in while they're having the dinner, but as soon as the dinner's over, I'm going to go and stand on the walls and listen to the presentation. And I hope I get a chance to have a conversation with Dr. Ben Carson, because I think Ben Carson is the epitome of the dream. I don't know if we would have had Ben Carson if Ben Carson had not embraced, through his mom, of course, but he had embraced the idea, too, that he could, in fact, rise above his condition, because they were poor down here in Detroit. And what Ben Carson did was to take the bull by the horn and not go with this war is mean, nothing can be done, these are the obstacles in the way, and we can't do anything about it. What he did was go forward, and from that lowly place in Detroit, we have the #1 pediatric neurosurgeon in the world, and that could not have happened anywhere else. Now let me tell you what I really wanted to tie that into. I'm going to come here in the studio one time, and I'm not going to have this cold. I'm going to shock the whole world. But I've been having this cold the last 3 weeks here, and I want you to just overlook that. At least I didn't get a bottle of water, and I hope they won't be criticizing me like they did Marco Rubio. The thing that Ben Carson's life shows is that if you open doors up, and there were some doors that were definitely open because of the civil rights movement, if you qualify yourself, I mean, they didn't give Ben Carson any affirmative action. This man is the #1 pediatric neurosurgeon in the world, and that couldn't have come through having a playing field where you are advantaging another group over another group, which is where they sabotaged the civil rights movement. Let me tell you what happened to me. And I was at the university in a workshop, and that was a hard time for me. I have to be honest with you. I just can't lie about it. That was a hard time for me, because I'm sitting there with some real heavyweights, and I'm listening to what I consider to be a lot of time just a lot of vacant noise. I'm saying this publicly because I just have to be honest. I cannot be untrue to what I believe and what my principles are. And I'm in this room on this one occasion. But there were a lot of other occasions too when I had to raise my hand and give my point of view. And my point of view pretty much was clashing with everybody else in the room. And that just has to happen. But in this one place, they were talking about this noise about the voter ID. And everybody in the room, almost to a man and woman, were talking about how discriminatory it was to require blacks to have an ID to vote. I had to ask a question in that room. Why is that not an impediment for whites? And why is it only an impediment for blacks? If you believe in King's dream, that if you in fact judge persons by the content of their character, then what are you saying about black people's character? And I had to tell them that they didn't like it too much, and I quite frankly didn't care whether they liked it or not, because I told them this is a mockery of the civil rights movement. And one of those persons in that room, and I were on a Black History program, and I spoke before he did. And when I came back to my chair, he was sitting right next to me, and his time he was going up after I finished. And as he was passing by me, he hugged me and said, "Moss, you always messing up." You know, it's good naturedly. But I have to tell you what my views are, and I think that's just one of the many ways in which we mocked the civil rights movement, and that was a mockery of the civil rights movement, because the impediments were white primaries. There were impediments of voting, such as hiding where the voting booth is going to be on a given day, saying it in this community and not telling the other community where the voting booth is going to be. That's an impediment. But when you start making things up, like the impediment is that you can't have a driver's license. I was down here getting my tags the other day. My birthday was on the 13th. Those of you who didn't send me candy, I'm mad at you. But I haven't put them out in my car yet, but I got my tags in the car in case I get stopped. I forgot, I put them on there. I'm a procrastinator. I have them on there before April. Before April is over. But when I went to the License Bureau, Secretary of State's office, to get my license, they wanted me to have a picture ID issued by the state. In fact, I have to tell you something. You know, one of the rites of passage we have in this country is that you want to get old enough to get your driver's license. That's just a rite of passage in this country. Every child wants to be an adult at some point. And then many of us in our childhood want to grow up before our time. We want to get to adulthood. Something about it was magical. You could do more things. You could be your own boss a little bit more. So it's something about arriving there. But one of the rites of passage is get that driver's license and then drive the car. You may not own the car, just the fact you can drive it. Take your girlfriend out on Friday night. Be back before your dad gets mad because the car is not out there. But to say that they couldn't get a driver's license, I think that's sabotage what King was talking about, because King was talking about judged not by the color of a person's skin. I mean, whites can get a driver's license, then blacks can get a driver's license. I don't know of any blacks, to be honest with you, that's over 18 years old. I don't know of any of them that don't have a driver's license. Many of them were driving to school, and when I was teaching high school, they would drive to school. They didn't have a driver's license. Well, they should have been arrested for driving without a license. But it was some big impediment. I think those kinds of conversations sabotage Dr. King's vision. And that brings me to what I was hearing on my way to the studio today, and I want to tell you about this conversation that was going on. You know, there's a film out now. I'm going to see it tomorrow just to critique it, called 42. 42 was a number of Jackie Robinson when he played with the Brooklyn Dodgers. And you know that Jackie Robinson was chosen out of the Black Baseball League. I don't know if he played with the Kansas City Monarchs or what team he was playing for before they drafted him into the Dodgers organization. He played for a while in Canada as they were grooming him to bring him into the major leagues. So he went into a couple of AA, AAA kind of leagues, but they were grooming him for breaking the color line in baseball. Now, let me say this first of all. Jackie Robinson is not the first black Major League Baseball player. There were some that were, hiding out under the color line. They were not recognized as being black. So in that sense, okay, he's the first first black person to play that was in fact notably and who deliberately came out, couldn't do anything else. Rob Robinson was very dark skinned, but he was one of the ones that was acknowledged as being black while he was playing the game. So he's the first one, for all practical purposes, that broke the color line, because you can't break it if you are not even aware that the person out there is not one of the ones in the majority group. So in that sense, he is a pioneer, and he did break the color line in baseball. Now, on the way to the studio, I'm listening to this radio program, and they were talking about the First Lady having a private showing of the film. And this is, I think, this is another example of betraying the civil rights movement and betraying the vision of Dr. King. It is reported, and I'm going to have to check this out for myself, but it is reported that when the First Lady she and her husband saw the film, their response to it was, and her statement was, it made her angry. And it showed that how far we still have to go. Now, how can that film indicate that it shows how far we have to go? And can you imagine the First Lady saying that, and she and her husband are in the White House? This is a mockery of the civil rights movement. Because, and I was thinking on the way to the studio, if you have a glass that's filled up halfway to the top, is that glass half empty or half full? Well, it's both, isn't it? So which of the two do you see it as being? And the First Lady sees it as being half empty, not half full. Otherwise, the emphasis would have been on, that's a treatment that Robinson faced in 1947, but they're not doing that now. The 7% of black players that come from the United States, they are there in the major leagues only because blacks don't play baseball anymore. They're playing basketball, and that's a choice that they have the right to make. But they're not excluded anymore. And at one time that was the case, and it's not the case right now. So why would you frame that as showing how much more that it had to be? There's this thing about how they treated Robinson. I'm going to see the film tomorrow, and I'm going to be watching it for a lot of reasons, one of which is I want to see what the intent is of it, because I think there's an intentionality behind these films coming out right now. I mean, there's nothing to point to in terms of what's going on today to victimize blacks. So they're bringing things out of the past to create an idea that the impediments are still in place. You're still being victimized by the racial order. I think a lot of that has to do with an intent behind these films coming out, like Durango, for example. And now we got this film on Jackie Robinson. It's not, he broke the color line in 47. Is this the 5th anniversary or something of that? 47 and 2013. Let's do the math here. What is this a milestone year? Is that why it's coming out? I'm going to be studying the people behind this film, because I think there's something else going on here in the social order coming out of Hollywood. It makes you wonder about what's the intent behind these films coming out. Durango, which had been made 37 times, and the last time it was made is this slave up here with a gun on his hip. He's gonna get revenge because they enslaved his people. He's gonna go shoot all the folks down. What is this about? And now Jackie Robinson comes up. I'm not saying we should forget Jackie Robinson. We should, in fact, honor Jackie Robinson. But for you to see the film and come out talking about you're mad, rather than coming out and saying that at the time of that film that was going on, we couldn't get a black president and a black first lady. We have both of those now. And for the First Lady to put that out there, if that's what she put out there, if that's her position, and she's saying that in front of black children, then that is a betrayal of the civil rights movement. There's no question about it. Because the narrative right now is that was then and this is now. Let me tell you something else that happened today along the same front. Because I spend a lot of time, I have to get off of it, but I spend a lot of time on Facebook. I'm ashamed to admit that because I'm not reading my books the way I should. I should be reading a couple of hours, maybe 3 hours a day, and I'm only putting an hour in here, an hour in there. And I got to do better because I got a backlog of books that I've got to get through. And there's one, I read this one here by Amity Shlaes, who wrote the book called The Forgotten Man, and she's got another book just came out called Coolidge. One of my favorite presidents, by the way, although you got him down there on the number 27. I've never seen Coolidge higher than the 27 greatest presidents that we've had. Mostly they put him down to like 31, somewhere around there, in terms of just dismissing him. And Amity Shlaes has a book out called Coolidge, but her first book, or at least the first one I read by her, is called The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression. And so I'm reading that. I got to get through that book somewhere between now and the end of next week. That's my goal, at least, to do that. But in terms of going to the movie and seeing Robinson and seeing the treatment that he received, we should watch that film and get and come away with the idea that that's a price that was paid back in that time period in 47, so that this can occur today. And that puts another responsibility upon those who are out here now to go forward knowing that that price does not have to be paid again. Robinson paid that price. And therefore, the question is, what do we need to be doing right now to carry that ball that he dropped? I think Robinson died in 76, somewhere around there. That when he deceased, life didn't stop, and commitment to bring about a better America did not stop. That is an ongoing process as you perfect the democracy in America or perfect the republic in America. That is an ongoing process where all of us have to play a role in it. I was thinking about something else that's on Facebook. One of my friends on Facebook posted, I don't know why that would be posted either. It was on the Tulsa, Oklahoma incident. She posted the bombing that occurred on what is called Black Wall Street. It didn't say, though, by the way, that there were a number of Black Wall Streets in America. Black people set up Black Wall Streets wherever they set down because they were insulated from the outside. They couldn't interact the way that they can today, so they were having to insulate themselves from outside, and they had to clean together because of the common interest in protecting themselves from the external forces that were hostile to them. So that was in a position that they may work to their advantage. For example, in Tulsa, which is what my friend was posting on today, she wasn't making this point, but I'm making it to get to what she said, but I want to make this point first. And that is, in Tulsa, the money that would reverberate around that community would, in fact, go around between 36 to 100 times before it got out of the community. Sometimes it took a year for that money that was circulating around in Tulsa to get outside of the Tulsa community, so that money was, in fact, it had what you call a multiplier effect. Those in the economics know what I'm talking about, where a dollar is $5 if it changes hands 5 times. So it multiplies its ability to affect a greater economic expansion if, in fact, it touches multiple hands. Today, contrast that with today, where the money would go around 36 to 100 times in the past, and then look at today, where the dollar leaves out of the community in 15 minutes. The average time period of a dollar in the community is 15 minutes before it vacates and goes elsewhere and enriches others and things like that. They're not going to talk about that. That would empower the community. They don't want Jesse Jackson, those guys, they don't want the community empowered. They want to have the community overwhelmed with the kind of noise that Michelle Obama is making. Anyway, the friend put on the post that they bombed Tulsa from the air. And if you think that the first time that there was a bombing that occurred was this, and this, or the bombing that occurred with this person out there in Oklahoma, I think it was, where they bombed that a federal building, and 60 people, I think, were killed in that building. They want to remind you that 1921, let's see, it was June the 1st, I think it was, in 1921, where the bombing had occurred. And they left it at that. It said that, this had happened back in that time period? Well, you can leave it at that point, but let's talk about what happened later on. What happened later was, 5 years later, was that every brick that was torn down in that attack, that's what it amounted to. It was actually a military attack. Not by the military, but by some people that had ill feelings about the progress being made by those blacks that had come to Oklahoma during the time period in which they were going to make Oklahoma pretty much a black state, maybe blacks and Indians. And blacks took that opportunity and ran with it. And so they were taking Tulsa and creating a community of businesses. There was something like, in that bombing that occurred, I think there were like 600 businesses that was destroyed, all owned by blacks. I forget how many churches were burned, but the community was devastated. But the story you can't keep the story there, because after the Wall Street of Black America, Tulsa was in fact bombed and burned and everything else and torn down. Within 5 years, and this is the story, in 5 years, that community was built back up brick by brick. Because as I said to that post that I was responding to, that it is not that there is a preponderance of racism in America today. What we have today is a preponderance of excuses that are being made. Back in that time period, you didn't have any room for excuses. You had to just go out there and do it. And what they did within 5 years, Tulsa was back in place. Tulsa wasn't actually taken out of commission until the 1960s, where there were greater options opened up, and people began to exercise these options, and therefore what had been the staple of people insulating themselves inside their own community and interacting with each other and sharing their money and this kind of thing, when that became passe because of integration, we saw Tulsa ended not by the bombing, although that was a very horrid event. That's not what ended Tulsa's Wall Street aspirations. It was ended by the fact that people began to lose their commitment to the idea of it being kept into existence. Because if the idea is not destroyed from within, then that idea cannot be destroyed. As long as the idea is contained and held by those inside the group, it cannot be destroyed, not by the outside force, because you carry it around in your head.
Did you ever see the movie V is for Vendetta? You ever see that movie?
I never saw that one.
Okay, it was based on what they call a graphic novel. Mm-hmm. And it was actually wrote during the Thatcher era in England by a guy who thought Thatcher was like the devil incarnate. And it's kind of relevant now because she just passed away. But anyway, the refrain through the book, through that movie, and through the graphic novel is government should be fearful of the people, and not the people fearful of the government. Also, basically, it comes down to what you just said too about the point you just making. That you got power in your own life, and you basically cannot, by just accepting status quo enough. It's great. It's a great thing. If I'll let you borrow the copy of I got.
Yeah.
Something, because it came out in the late early 2000s. The movie did. Mm-hmm. So,
well, John, the point that we're both making here is that it is not really what is happening to you that's going to determine your destiny. What's going to determine your destiny is your responses to it. And their response was to continue to go. And it's amazing when you look at the history in its totality, not looking at it from the victimization standpoint, but looking at it in its totality, what you see that is so riveting is the fact that the more you push back on those people at that time that had this tenacity and perseverance in terms of what they were trying to accomplish, is that they came back. I was telling my brother, I have a half brother down in Detroit, and his mother is the brother who's married to Arthur Lucy. His mother has a brother married to the woman that integrated the University of Alabama. And when I was talking about Vivian Malone, who George Wallace blocked her from going to the school. He brought up Arthur and Lucy's name. He said, "What about her?" So I said, "Let me tell you about Arthur and Lucy. Nobody blocked her from the schoolhouse door. What her story is a little bit different. Her story goes back to 1952, and what happened to her was she put an application in at the University of Alabama, and they didn't know she was black. But when she showed up, they did a little joke there, and they were surprised this was a black person applying for the University of Alabama because that had never happened before. And they now got a problem on their hand, and they decided not to let her in because of the fact she was black. So they turned her away. For 4 years, that was in 1952, and for 4 years, from 1952 to 1956, it was fought in court. Arthur Shores is one of the attorneys, and of course, you know this guy now, that this jurist, the first black on the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall was the other attorney, and they fought that case for 4 years. And Arthur and Lucy came back. Now we don't talk about that. We talk about they turned her away. They did X, Y, and Z. They don't talk about what was the response to it. Her response was to resist it. King was saying injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And what they were doing was fighting not only against the injustice against themselves, but fighting for a greater America. Can we get back to embedding, trying to change the narrative for the betterment of the country? One guy called, there's one guy that called me last night. I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to get on this one Facebook wall. There's a gentleman out here, so-called leader, that's out here talking about how angry black children are, and they're mad because in their genes they know they're great, and they're mad because they know that they're not allowed to do X, Y, and Z. No, that's not why they're mad. They're mad because you leaders out there have sold them nothing but bitterness over the course of their lives, telling them all these things, what Michelle's talking about. It made me mad. Why would it make you mad? It's not happening to you. It's happening to Jackie Robinson, who deceased in 1976, doesn't even live, not even around anymore. His legacy still lives. But that legacy is one that led incrementally to those people like Michelle that's in the White House right now. You didn't have nobody in the White House at that point that was black other than doing maybe the black cabinet under Roosevelt, or maybe Robert Weaver, who was the Secretary of HUD under Robert Kennedy. You certainly were not talking about a black president, not one that was visible at least. And now you got a black president talking about that made you mad, and you're telling that to the children rather than telling them to celebrate the fact that that day has now gone, and we don't have to go through that anymore. Where children will have some hope that's the Rubicon has been crossed, and you don't have to cross it one anymore. What you have to do right now is understand some doors have been opened, and your job now is very different than the job of Jackie Robinson, who knocked doors down, open doors. Your job is prepare yourself.
I'd like to remind the First Lady, she goes on, she thinks she's got this reason to be so bitter about, race relations in this country. But in Europe, in England, it's different times. If you're a Protestant, you're hounded by the Catholics. If you're a Catholic, you're hounded by the Protestants. And you know what? Even with, everybody a lot of people try to dismiss that by saying, well, they're all white people, they could easily blend. I bet you, if you actually want to do the end analysis, more people died being the wrong denomination in Europe than the blacks did, who are remarkably different physically by the whites to the whites around them. Then in the analysis, people died more because of religious differences and intolerances in Europe than they did because of racial problems in this country. I'll guarantee that.
There's no question about that, and that's another part of the discourse that's not talked about. So that you see your problems in a vacuum, you don't see the totality of the problem that the human family has. I'm proud of my country, and I'm proud of America for a number of reasons, and that is to know the history, the narrative of this country, and to see what the country once was in fact practicing, and what it's doing right now. And in fact, when it was practicing slavery, it wasn't practicing slavery to the exclusion of the rest of the world. The whole world was practicing slavery. We're the only ones that feel guilty about it. Slavery, and I can give you a page number for this one. It's called The Real Story of Slavery in Sowell's book. It's page 111 of his book. I suggest everybody read that. If you don't read anything else in that chapter 4 of his book, if you don't read anything else in that book, read page 111 of that book, because what he's talking about is the universality of slavery. And this idea that it only happened here, only happened once, and the only practitioners were in the United States is ludicrous. I mean, it's laughable for a person to go around believing that, just like it's ludicrous for these liberals be walking around here feeling guilty about it. When slavery was stopped in the West, where it was a practice everywhere else in the world, the West stopped it. They certainly were part of the practice at a certain point, but they're the one who put the skid marks to it.
There's more slavery going on now. If you want to look at numbers of people being enslaved right now than there had been at the time when England and France and the Netherlands were still practicing slavery and were trying to end that practice in their colonies or the countries that start up after they're after being colonized.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's so disingenuous for the civil rights leadership now to overlook the fact that there's other things going on. They can try to use their energies to focus on the other countries now, which have more horrific conditions for slavery going on now than they ever would. Slavery doesn't exist here.
Yes. And
they just seem to want to. They know that over there they basically would be, they're not going anywhere with that. There's no more argument they can make. They're not going to a moral group of people and saying, look at how bad you should be ashamed of yourself. That kind of approach doesn't impact on those kind of people. Actually, if you're just brutal, you have to be brutal on those kind of people.
We know that the fallacious leadership we have over the civil rights movement, the civil rights organizations, can be seen by the fact that there's not one of the civil rights organizations out there that would embrace Ben Carson or his story. Anytime you have the leading pediatric neurosurgeon in the world, and no one will use him as a role model to show the possibilities of black children, you're not trying to help the black community out. You're trying to keep it disadvantaged so that you can have something to complain about in terms of grievance. This man there's no peer in the world, and black children should know about this person. Know about Robinson too. But they're talking about all these impediments in our way, which you're more imagining impediments than anything else. Many of them are put in your way by not going forward. The children not going forward because we overwhelm them with all this negativity. Talking about the film made you mad. How could a film make you mad about something that happened back in '47, and you can't see no evidence of that going on right now? Nobody's blocking anybody from playing Major League Baseball today. That happened more than 50 years ago. And we're talking about something in the past we should be aware of, but we should be reminded of it only because it helps us to understand how far we've come and the possibilities that are embedded in this country. Nobody else has that history. The kinds of impediments that are in place in African societies. I'll be in Africa this summer, and I'll tell you this. Those impediments that were in the African societies at the point of independence, at the ending of the colonial period, those impediments are still there. Only very few of those countries have overcome those colonial impediments. And these are not colonial impediments. This is corruption among the leadership that has not changed the conditions of the people there. And I'll be in a couple of those countries. I better close my mouth before I get over there and have to fight my way back out of the country. But I've had some dealings over there. And when I come back here, I don't have those dealings over here. And so I know what this country represents. It's not perfect. But I'll tell you this also, and that is, it's not a country that I would get mad over watching what happened to Jackie Robinson back in 1947. I would understand that happened, but I would be appreciative coming out of that theater that thank God that Robinson dealt with that so that this generation doesn't have to deal with it. And for Michelle Obama not to see that and not to say it to black children is a betrayal of the civil rights movement. That there's no question. Want you to stay tuned to all the programs here at flinttalkradio.com. We are working hard to become your station of choice, and want to thank you for staying tuned for the last hour. Don't forget, as always, to follow your dream. Because if you don't follow your dream, you will never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.